Hi, my name is Kamilla Elliott and I am Professor of Literature and Media at Lancaster University. I work there in the Department of English Literature and Creative Writing. This video discusses some of the cultural contexts of Tennessee Williams' play A Streetcar Named Desire. And the focus here is on the family and its relationship to the family in society. So the contents here are, first we're going to have a look at Williams's own family, his father, his mother, his sister. Then we're going to look at some of his relationships outside of the family. And part two, we'll look at families in 1946 after the war, what it was like for men, what it was like for women when the men came back. And finally, we're going to bring that knowledge into understanding and studying families in the play. So we're going to start with the biographical family context. Tennessee Williams lived between 1911 and 1983. Here's a very debonair photograph of him sitting at a rehearsal. So his mother, Edwina, was a minister's daughter, absolutely doting mother, who fantasized constantly about Southern living and was absolutely obsessed with social status. So already you can guess who she might represent. The father, Cornelius, was a traveling shoe salesman, later on a manager, and he was an abusive alcoholic with a violent temper, an avid poker player, and he forced his son, Tennessee, to leave university to go to work in 1932. So you could think about his parents as perhaps a marriage between Blanche and Stanley. But his sister Rose also has some connections to Blanche. She was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and in 1937 she was sent away to a mental institution, and later on suffered in 1943 a failed lobotomy. She was absolutely destroyed by having been sent away by their father. This is, of course, reminiscent of Blanche at the end of the play being sent away by the brutal Stanley. But there was another kind of sending away. Tennessee Williams soon after relocated and left the family as well. He sent himself away to New Orleans in 1938 and was there for over 40 years, though like his father, he was constantly traveling. Williams recounts, "I came here to write. I was heartbroken over my sister Rose's confinement in a psychiatric hospital, and I suffered a breakdown myself." Again, there's a difference between what happens to boys and what happens to girls. "In New Orleans, I felt a freedom. I could catch my breath here. At that time, I was under the impression that I was dying. Without that sense of fatigue and that idea of imminently approaching death, I doubt I could have created Blanche Dubois." This comes from a 1971 interview with Rex Reed for Esquire magazine. In 1938, he wrote on 20th of December in his journal, "I'm delighted, in fact enchanted, with this glamorous old town. I've been here about 3 hours. Here surely is the place I was made for, if any place in this funny old world." So the French Quarter of New Orleans at that time was a sexually permissive environment, a mix of ethnicities, classes, and cultures, and you see some of that in the play as well. Williams continues his interview in 1970 with Donnelly Keith. There's an interview where he said this, "In New Orleans, I found the kind of freedom I'd always needed, and the shock of it against the puritanism of my nature has given me a subject, a theme, which I've never ceased to exploit." Now, Williams was homosexual, but like Blanche, he tried continually to hide his sexuality. There wasn't much acceptance of homosexuality. However, the way that the French Quarter accepted people and ways of life also signaled for Williams the beginnings of his own sexual awakening. And he had to work in a restaurant to make ends meet, so he wasn't there as a sort of dilettante bourgeois son. This Pancho Rodriguez was one of William's lovers, and he was a lover between 1946 and 48, and that's the period of time when the play was first being written and staged. It premiered in 1947. Now, Pancho was a Mexican-American boxer, 10 years Williams Jr., and again, sort of reminiscent of Blanche chasing younger men. However, he was also a model for Stanley Kowalski. Williams met him in Mexico, and actually Pancho wanted Stanley to be Mexican-American rather than Polish. In one of his letters from Hollywood, Pancho had urged Johnny not to abandon New Orleans. "Don't come to California," he warned. "Here in Los Angeles, we are considered peons like we were in Texas. In New Orleans, we live in an international city and we are treated with respect and good jobs. Both Ten and I can't wait to get back to work, to be back home." Frank Merlo was another lover, and he began his relationship with Williams in 1947, again the year the play was first staged, and it continued until 1963. His ancestry was Sicilian, and he is another model for Stanley Kowalski. Williams met Frank Merlo in a bar, and they stayed lovers until Williams' death in 1963. However, Williams here is more identified with Blanche than he is with either of these men. And his biographer, Fred Lahr, said, "Freud notes hysterical suffering is a way of remembering the child's suffering, and that's what Williams was about. He would always say about his plays they were too hysterical, that he had to pull back the violence, the screaming." Tennessee Williams wrote in his memoirs, "I am as much of an hysteric as Blanche." And I think this hysteria gives us some insight into how much he suffered as a sensitive child from his father's violence, witnessing it and being the victim of it. Right, part 2 now is we're going to make some more broad cultural contexts about families. From this biography, we're going to move to what was happening to families in 1946 after World War II had ended. At this time, men are returning from war, seeking to re-establish their dominance, get their jobs back, while working women are having to return from the workplace where they'd had some autonomy and positive experiences of their own competence. They're being pressured to return to the home. And there were laws and also unwritten laws where women had to make space for the men to come back. Increasingly, women became dependent on men economically. At this time, because of long periods of separation, there was also an increasing birth rate and the baby boom. So think of the fact that Stella here is expecting a baby in the play. The men coming back from the war, however, were not so simply straightforward, ready to go back to work. Many men came back injured with traumatized masculinity. Some of them had physical injuries. Many of them had endured psychological trauma and were damaged. Furthermore, women filling men's jobs during the war challenged their masculinity. If women can do that as well as we can, how am I still a man? And you'll see some posters like this back home for keeps, where the artist is trying to re-establish male dominance. And you could do a close reading of this picture. There's the farm in the background and nature, as if this is kind of natural. And the woman is in a position where if he were to let go, she'd fall over. He's holding her up. He's still in uniform, even though he's back home. And again, this kind of recreation of female dependence in post-war America, where gender differences were accentuated in costumes, clothing, and roles and so on, particularly in white middle-class America. Intriguingly, casting Marlon Brando as Stanley in the play, he's also Stanley in the film, Williams comments on his casting, and he says a new value came out of Brando's reading, his audition, which is by far the best reading I have ever heard. He seemed to have already created a dimensional character of the sort that the war has produced among young veterans. This idea of the damaged veteran coming back, and Brando somehow encompassing this in his performance of Stanley. Part of what happens in this play is that men reassert their masculinity by being violent to women, especially Stanley. And here's a photo from the stage play where other men are holding him back from hitting Stella, his wife. Intriguingly, going back to these adverts, there are attempts to sell merchandise by showing men dominating women. So we have this at the top: are you a man dragging your woman by the hair, or are you a mouse being dragged by the hair by a woman? Assert yourself in these bold, bold colors. And there again, the man is upright and prominent and not even looking at the woman, and she's sort of hanging onto him and leaning on him. Here's one that's actually got violence encoded in it. It's daring, it's audacious, it's the bolder looking shirts. And here he's smacking the woman and he's bending her over, again, kind of forcibly pushing her down into a dependent position where she can't support herself. And the implication is that after she's been through all this, although it does look like a different woman in the next picture, she's going to love and adore you. Disturbing attitudes to women following the war in an attempt to somehow establish masculine power at the expense of the women who'd carried things while they were away. So now we're going to pull this into all of these readings, into how these cultural contexts outside of the play inform the families inside the play. So if we think about the play, it's clear that it's male relatives over several generations who've lost everything at Belle Reve, which used to be a profitable sort of upper-class southern plantation where Blanche and her sister lived. And the reason they've lost everything is due to, quote, their epic fornications. The fact that it seems they've sort of sinned sexually, again, sort of transgression with and of women. But there's also changing national economic structures. And this will be expanded in another video, where the way that you make money in the South after the war isn't the same. Industry, which Stanley is part of in New Orleans, and it is taking over. But in the play, we have Stanley both earning and gambling away the household income. He claims everything belongs to him, and he determines to take what Stella has inherited as his share of Belle Reve under the Napoleonic Code, which granted part of every inheritance to husbands. Sadly, and more devastatingly, the process of this play is that he gradually takes everything that Blanche has: her reputation, her chance to marry, her freedom, her sanity, and her sister's loyalty. So let's turn to think about women in the play. So Stella represents the baby boom. She's reproducing and mixing old blood with new, the old sort of burned out, worn out Southern aristocratic blood with new blood, the blood of lower class industrial workers. And again, this is a symbol of how the nation is going to be strengthened and integrated Remember, New Orleans is in the south as well, but it's a different kind of south to the old south of Belle Reve. But we have Blanche stuck in the past. She's waiting for a man to rescue her from her own life wars. And in reality, she's an aging woman who has chased underage boys, posing as prim, virtuous, virginal even, while lying about her age and her drinking. She is waiting for Shep Huntley, who is a lover she had years ago, thinking he must come back. And she's also waiting for Mitch. Blanche looks at Mitch and among all these other working class men, and she says, that one seems superior to the others. Stella says, yes, he is. Now, Mitch is unmarried. His girlfriend died, and there's a poetic inscription to her in a silver cigarette case. He's a romantic. And he's also good at caring for the woman in his life, his sick mother. But as he gets to discover more and more about Blanche, his kindness and her hope diminish. First, he talks about his mother. She says to go out, so I go, but I don't enjoy it. I keep wondering how she is. He's not able to be selfish in the way that Stanley so clearly is. And playing cards, he feels, I've got to go back and be with my mother. I'm out, deal me out. And he's quite prim himself. And he says, sadly but firmly, poker should not be played in a house with women. But after he discovers the truth about Blanche, belied in this photograph and belied in her stories and her performance, he says to her, you're not clean enough to bring into a house with my mother. Absolutely devastating. The problem with traditional gender roles in this relationship is that Mitch is actually observing the gentlemanly Southerner in reality, while Blanche only pretends to observe the chaste and virtuous Southern belle in her life. Blanche's problem is she can't go back in time and she can't go back in space. Belle Reve is gone, her youth is gone, her virtue is gone, and her reputation is gone. But sadly, because she's so stuck in the past and trying to keep on performing as if she lives in it, she can't move forward either. Her performance is totally out of kilter in this space of a New Orleans apartment. And she just continues in the same way at the end. She says, I will die with my hand in the hand of some nice-looking ship's doctor, a very young one with a small blonde moustache. So now it's time to think about gender in relationship to sex and violence in the play. Stella and Stanley have an incredibly passionate and also a violent relationship. And when Stella returns to Stanley after he has hit her, she says to Blanche, there are things between a man and woman in the dark that make everything else seem unimportant. Blanche replies, what you are talking about is brutal desire, just desire, the name of that rattletrap streetcar that bangs through the quarter. Stella asks, haven't you ever ridden on that streetcar? And Blanche replies, it brought me here where I'm not wanted and I'm ashamed to be. Now let's have a look at Blanche and Stanley. And this is the more troubling part of the violence in this play, although all violence is troubling. And we need to think about what the rape represents. Now, first and foremost, it is a rape, pure and simple. It represents rape. But there are other questions to be asked about what that dynamic is gesturing to. And that's where we're going to go now. What does the author say that the rape represents? Now, you have to remember that this is Williams. He's writing to the film censor, Joseph Breen, who doesn't want the rape in the film, and he's trying to keep it in there. So he's going to say what it means in some way that perhaps the film censor will listen to, and in fact he did. And he argues the rape of Blanche by Stanley is a pivotal, integral truth in the play, without which the play loses its meaning, which is the ravishment of the tender, the sensitive, the delicate, by the savage and brutal forces of modern society. So we can think back to Williams's family, where he was sensitive, tender, and delicate as a child, and the brutal, savage abuse of him by his father. And we could also think, though, about Williams's mother's sort of yearning for the genteel, nostalgic, aristocratic South, and the way that industrialization has done away with a lot of that kind of art and culture. So we're now going to have to think about some other issues, about what else the rape represents. So here are some readings that have been offered of this. Some people say it's Blanche's inability to face the real world, and the real world catching up with her and destroying her. The idea of nature overcoming culture, animal joy versus poetry and art. But I'm not sure that I like this interpretation, because it kind of dilutes and exculpates the violence and abuse of rape. I don't think it's just nature. It's something much more than that. Another interpretation that perhaps is a little bit closer to what Williams was interested in was the idea that it represents the new order overthrowing the old order. And there's evidence for this in the play. Before it happens, Stanley says to Blanche, "We've had this date with each other from the beginning, back in time, before even these characters, and more in terms of the society. This is the lower class overpowering the higher class." And prior to this, Blanche is constantly putting Stanley down for his class, and she gets Stella to join her, and Stanley rages, "Don't you ever talk that way to me. Pig, Polak, disgusting, vulgar, greasy. Them kind of words have been on your tongue and your sisters too much around here. What do you two think you are, a pair of queens? Every man is a king, and I am the king around here, so don't forget it." And here we circle back from other possible symbolisms to a wider culture in which men are trying to dominate women by abuse and violence. Just think back to that shirt advert where a woman's beaten and pulled by the hair, and then there is this passionate kiss at the end of it, much like Stella's. Thank you for listening.